Ah, damn, this freak sure is something. The man with the shotgun seemed to be having a little too much fun. He'd killed Mr. Blank 3 more times, but it was becoming more of a close call with every encounter. Who is this guy? I called out to Sven. Jimmy, an old friend. I hunt weird shit for sport, Jimmy said, in the midst of reloading his shotgun, a ferocious gaze on his face. But don't boil me down to just that. I like a lot of stuff. What kind of stuff? I thought to myself. And I guess it really didn't matter. I came to a realization. Mr. Blank had his hands full with Jimmy, which meant I had a chance. I bolted up and began running. Call it a selfish move. I hardly cared at that point. Shotgun blasts rocked the space around me as I ran, following the obscure tree carvings towards an unknown destination. I couldn't tell you what I was expecting to find. I didn't even know if there was going to be anything waiting for me at all. Nevertheless, I ran, and I never considered stopping. The whole journey took me a lot longer than I thought. I'd gotten deep into the forest before the carvings had disappeared altogether. This is it, I thought as I feverishly looked around for something. But what the hell was I looking for? After a while of searching, I finally spotted a clue. Another carving. Not on a tree this time. It was on a large rock, right beside what appeared to be a small opening leading to a cave within. Not ominous in the slightest. Jeez, am I really gonna go in there? By all accounts, nothing would lead a rational person to enter such a space. But I was far from rational at that point. I'd also stopped hearing the shotgun blasts a while ago. That could only mean one thing. That Mr. Blank was about to be on my ass again. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, into whatever the hell was awaiting me in the darkness. The cave itself, if you want to call it that, it was more comparable to a large hole in a rock, was larger on the inside than it looked on the outside, but not drastically. It was still relatively tight as I traversed into it, and for the first few seconds I could make out nothing but darkness, but it didn't take long to find out what I'd unknowingly been searching for this whole time. There was a light ahead, like one derived from a small flame, and it was moving. Somebody, or something, was holding it up. Making out any details from the angle and distance I was standing at wasn't quite possible, so I was forced to move forward if I wanted any answers. So you've come for me, huh? It wasn't the kind of voice that I had expected. Not low, guttural, or menacing in the slightest. Whoever was speaking sounded meek and terrified, on the verge of tears. But first impressions can deceive. I stayed on my toes, preparing myself for anything. From everything I'd experienced so far, anything was certainly possible. What do you mean? I asked in a low voice, as to not trigger any sudden aggression. How did you find me? The man asked. Oh, the carvings led you right to me, I suppose. The man turned, his face partially illuminated by a large candle he was holding dangerously close to his skin. I could hardly make out any distinguishable features. His hair was long and scraggly. His facial hair appeared to be untrimmed. Tired eyes. Things that aren't terribly rare these days. But what I did find interesting was his shirt. Black and maroon. A white name tag. It read Colin. It was all too familiar. He had to be an employee from somewhere I'd seen before. But where? I guess that's what I wanted, though, he said, his voice getting shaky. To finally pay for what I've done. What are you talking about? What have you? I stopped my question partway through, due to a sudden, jarring realization. So that's where I recognized the uniform from. The theater. The one where this shit show had all started. I recalled the details of that investigation. A new employee, joined not too long ago, now missing. It was him, wasn't it? You son of a bitch. I could hardly control the words as they came out of my mouth. By all accounts, this guy was the reason Lacey went missing. It took everything out of me to not strangle him right then and there. Those urges were pushed even further when he chuckled. I see. You're not the police. Just someone looking for vengeance. That's not so good for me, but I suppose it's what I deserve. He sighed, putting the candle down at his feet, illuminating a pile of empty soda cans and cellophane wrappers behind him. Go ahead. I won't fight back. I took about half a minute to calm myself down. It didn't quite work. I was still seething, my fists shaking like hell. If I were Mike, this guy's face would have been reduced to mush already. Luckily for him, I wasn't Mike. I suppose it was lucky for me as well. Beyond anything, I needed answers. I took a deep breath, unclenching my hands and forcing my emotions to the curb. At least, I tried. You're responsible for this, aren't you? You screened that damn film. I could see the man's silhouette nod. I gulped down my anger. What the hell are you doing out here? He dropped his head. I can't go back into town. I'm not strong enough to face what I've done. A moment of silence followed. I could see him shaking ever so slightly. His breathing gradually became rapid and uneven, like he was forcing down tears. A man? Is that what you are? After doing what you did, I'm not so sure. That's the part you don't understand. He'll force you to do things you never could have fathomed doing before, all without laying a single finger on you. What? You're scared of monsters under the bed. Yeah, he did that shit to me as well, but I didn't crack from it. They didn't have to take 12 people down with me either. Monsters. Yeah, turning into monsters is one of his tricks, but nowhere near the worst one. I could feel the anger coming back. Look, if you couldn't handle it, maybe you should have just. I stopped myself from finishing the sentence. It wasn't something I really didn't want to say, even given the circumstances. Just taking my own life, right? Yes, I guess I'd agree. I suppose it all started with me. I began, now at a sudden loss for words. I tried recomposing myself. Freaking out wasn't going to get me anywhere. What did you mean when you said that turning into monsters wasn't his worst trick? I meant what I said. He goes by trial and error, turns into the things he thinks will evoke the most fear out of us. Horror movie villains, monsters from folklore. Those are the good options, the simplest ones as well. But that won't work on everybody, and it didn't work on me. I raised an eyebrow in the dark. What? When he can't scare you by using such direct tactics, he tries harder, digs deeper into the recesses of your mind, what would petrify you the most. Things that would drive you to the darkest corner of your soul. You'll start to feel mad, just short of being catatonic, cognizant enough to carry out his orders, but too constrained by visceral fear to do anything else. You'll feel nothing but emptiness, a cold void where your heart once was. Hopes, desires, any kind of positive emotion completely gone. You'll feel
Blank.
He paused again.
I may not be the strongest, but I don't even think the strongest could cope with that.
It took me a minute to think about what he'd just said. If he was right, then, well, that was bad news. My anger suddenly took a backseat to apprehension.
He's chasing you right now, isn't he? Mr. Blank will probably kill me once he catches up. He has no use for me anymore after all.
He paused again, lighting a cigarette this time.
But I can't say I would mind that.
He gave a long drag.
I'm truly sorry for any grief I may have caused you, but there's nothing I can do anymore. Nothing we can do.
I didn't want to accept it. Nothing? Like, we can't find a way to beat him somehow? Can't find a way to get those missing people back? He took another drag.
Unfortunately.
What in the Sam hell are you doing hiding in a cave? He was cut off by a familiar southern accent. I turned around, seeing Jimmy and Sven standing at the mouth of the cave. Sven told me to follow these witch drawings and they led me to a yellow-bellied coward. The hell you running away from the fight for? Jimmy said, clearly upset that I'd gone ahead without him. I also noticed that his shotgun was over his shoulder and not in his hands. What the hell are you doing? He's gonna... That weird sumbitch ain't gonna do shit. He disappeared some time ago. Lost count of how many times I killed him. How many of my precious bullets I wasted on him, damn it. Disappeared? I asked, perplexed. Yeah, Sven spoke up. It's been around 8 minutes. Unless it's planning on a surprise attack. Looks like it's gone for now. Who the hell is that behind you? I turned around, seeing Colin now standing up, which startled me a bit.
What do you mean it's gone?
He said, sounding shocked at the prospect. The hell do you think we mean? It got up and disappeared. Vamoosed. Maybe it got tired from being slaughtered. Who on God's green earth knows? Colin stepped forward, moving more into the daylight. As expected, he looked like hell. Smelled like it too. I could see Jimmy and Sven physically react to his appearance, but his eyes were different than I'd imagined. Not so hopeless like his words. In fact, they were brimming with determination. He looked at me, if only slightly.
We have a chance here, but we have to move quick. It's happened before.
What has? I was having a hard time keeping up with Colin as he ran. For a guy that looked like the product of an apocalypse, he sure as hell was fast on his feet. Sven and Jimmy followed behind, shouting after him.
Him disappearing. The Southerner is right. When he bleeds over into our world, he tires himself out, especially if he keeps on taking different forms.
What? How the hell do you know all of this? He suddenly stopped running, causing me to nearly crash into his back.
He began, before taking a deep breath. It's a long story. I'll have to explain quickly.
And as much as it scares me to admit, his story sounded eerily similar to mine. It all started with the incident years prior, the last time Mr. Blank had made an appearance. When Sven's fiancée had disappeared, and Colin's brother had disappeared along with her. He was living halfway across the country when it had happened, though. When he'd heard about his missing sibling, and the obscure details that went along with it, he booked the first flight over and attempted to figure things out for himself. It went as you'd expect. devoid of any trustworthy leads, lack of any real direction. It took him an entire week of relentless and dangerous searching to learn the name Mr. Blank. And that's where it all started going downhill for him. But even then, he didn't stop. Colin started getting visits from him the same way that I had. Just like he'd done with me, Mr. Blank's psychological torment started off fairly surface level. 80s horror movie villains, ghosts in the closet, creatures standing outside his window, etc. While they certainly took a toll on him at first, he endured, continuing his search in spite of it all. He even tried attacking Mr. Blank directly, just as I had. Wouldn't work out so well, as he went on to learn. Maybe he was lying about it all, I don't know. But I could feel my anger towards him gradually fading as he relayed his story to me. He hadn't really done anything different than I had. Well, I guess he had. He did everything completely alone. I had Mike and Rose with me. After Colin had trudged through Mr. Blank's initial onslaught, the latter started pushing harder, trying to break him completely. This is where Colin's story truly began diverging from my own. Mr. Blank began using more abstract scare tactics. For example, Colin came home once to find his father standing in the corner of his bedroom, and his dad died some years prior. He didn't do anything, though. He just stood there with a blank expression like a mannequin, day and night, for nearly 2 weeks. On top of that, he'd get more and more frail by the hour, as if he were rapidly losing weight. By the end, he was essentially a skeleton. That resulted in the first bona fide mental breakdown of Colin's life. And of course, it wasn't even close to ending there. The psychological stress and torment he experienced sounded like enough to make anybody lose it completely. He'd see faces of pure malice and hatred staring at him in the mirror. He'd see a bottomless pit in the middle of his living room, while the hellish screams constantly emanated from within it. Every time he'd opened up a toilet, the face of his sister, who drowned to death, would be staring up at him, gasping for air. He couldn't bring himself to describe the worst of it, though. Just that his deepest, most visceral fears were manifesting in front of his very eyes, and it was breaking him, minute by minute. It reached a point where he attempted to take his own life. He walked onto his balcony in the middle of the night and looked over the railings from the 14th floor. He stared down at the ground with his mind running a mile a minute. But before he closed his eyes and took the plunge, he saw a figure with a blank face staring at him from below. He said that he froze in that moment. While they stared at each other, he said that he was coming to an understanding, an implied agreement. Do what I want, and I'll end this hell for you. He felt a transitory comfort, combined with a sensation of overwhelming coercion. In other words, he didn't have a choice in the matter. It's not like I can explain it. He was fucking with my head. It felt like I'd face something worse than death if I didn't play by his rules, if I didn't do what he said. Go ahead and think what you want about me, but you weren't there. You couldn't have understood. Right, I said, trying to digest what I'd just been told.
Do you still hate me?
I sighed to myself. I don't know, did I? It depends. You said that we had a chance. What did you mean by that?
Yes, we do. I can help you get her back. Everything just has to go right.
My ears perked up. All right, go on then.
We can defeat him. Kill him. All we have to do is capture him on tape.
I raised an eyebrow. That's it? Are you kidding me?
It's not what you think. What's been chasing you up until this point hasn't been the real Mr. Blank. Not his real form, anyway. That's what we need to capture. Don't ask me how it works, but he can't exist in two mediums or digital spaces at once. His one real weakness, the film that was shown when everybody went missing, that's the first one. Get him on tape with your own camera, and that'll be the second one.
Well, how the hell are we supposed to see its true form?
That's the hard part. He only sends out puppets when he crosses over into our world, in order to see him as he truly is. We have to enter his.
Is that where? I began asking. He nodded.
Yes, that is where your girlfriend is.
How do we get there? Colin reached into his backpack and pulled out a film reel.
Watching the film almost acts like a passageway between his world and ours.
A more involved explanation really wasn't necessary. In fact, the whole situation began making a lot more sense. I used to ask myself why Mr. Blank chose our town, why the hell he just had to come here. Well, the theater that it happened at was an older one. A classic place, so to speak. It was one of the few places that still used projectors. What's it like in there? Colin shook his head.
I couldn't tell you, but from what I've learned, the people trapped in his world are essentially being used as fuel. Mr. Blank feeds on inherent negative human emotions. Anguish, uncertainty, despair, fear. He doesn't kill them, just keeps them there for himself. Keeps them in a constant state of terror. Most go catatonic after a few years in real time, but it hardly feels like a week for them while in there. That's why he keeps coming back here for more. He'll never stop. Even if every theater stops using film, I'm sure that he'll find a way.
He sighed.
I'm not proud of what I've done, but if I'm going to do anything good with my life, it's stopping this bastard forever.
If that was true, then Lacey was essentially in hell. She'd been in hell for weeks, but I suppose it's only like a few hours to her. How long do we have until he comes back and tries to kill us again?
I can't give you an exact amount of time, but I doubt that we have more than a few hours.
I took a deep breath as we reached the edge of the forest. Sven and Jimmy were close behind, catching up to us soon after.
What in the hell were you two yammering about?
I turned to look at him. Jimmy, we might need your help for a bit. Then I turned to Sven and grinned. Let's bury this son of a bitch. My hand shook as I held the film reel. This is the source of it all. The reason Lacey went missing, the reason any of this shit had happened at all. As determined as I was to see this operation through, a lingering feeling of fear and hesitance never left my side. What's the film like, exactly? I asked, my voice shaking just a tad. I don't know. Not like I ever watched it. Can't really prepare you much there, sorry. That was more or less the response I was expecting. Colin sighed, starting to look anxious.
We don't have time, though. He could come back at any moment.
He looked at Jimmy.
You still have ammo?
Jimmy tapped his belt proudly.
Silly question. Ain't no monster getting the jump on me.
The haphazard plan that we formulated went as follows. We'd rush over to the theater where everything had started, since that was the only place where we'd actually be able to play the film. And since it was still likely being monitored by the police, we'd have to rely on Sven's FBI badge to dissolve that suspicion. According to Colin, if Mr. Blank's projection hadn't come back to attack us before we managed to enter the theater, it sure as hell was going to be there once we did. And of course, it was going to be aggressive. That's where Jimmy comes in. He was going to keep it distracted while Colin set up the film. Once he did, Sven and I would be the ones to watch it. He wanted to save his wife. I wanted to save Lacey. Neither of us were backing down. Colin also gave us some very much needed details regarding the film itself, even though a lot of it was just speculation on his part. Supposedly, the film does something strange to the viewer's state of mind. The film itself exists in one plane of existence, Mr. Blank's. We exist in our own. So how does somebody traverse this gap and move from one to the other? Well, we could really only theorize there. Colin claimed it was about emotions. The range of human emotions are a spectrum, obviously, but not a two-dimensional one, with happiness and sadness, distress and calm, pain and pleasure at their respective extremes. Nearly every feeling spurred on by activities in our daily lives are different. Some are more similar to each other than others, but no two distinct feelings are truly identical. Even the same emotion that you perceive experiencing thousands of times over the course of your life is actually an entirely new experience each and every time. I'm getting off track here. Look, emotions are complicated, and according to Colin's theory, they also acted as a catalyst that could move conscious thoughts between different realities. If some kind of impulse evoked a strong and specific enough emotion, that could act as said catalyst. But if it were only their thoughts that had been moved, then what the hell had happened to their bodies? That mystery remained, but Colin was quite certain that the people who'd been transported were all still alive. You can't feed off a dead person's emotions after all. There's something else that you'd probably like to know. Something really interesting. My ears perked up. I did know a few people that crossed over into Mr. Blank's realm that managed to make it back out. They all told me that they felt themselves crossing over a certain threshold of fear before they left our own world. But they were still somewhat cognizant of what had happened. They knew that they were still in the theater, that this wasn't the world that they belonged to. They weren't petrified to the point where they lost all sense of their past reality. Because of this, they always kept themselves grounded, convincing themselves that none of it was real, despite what Mr. Blank threw at them. Eventually, they got back using the sheer will of their mind alone. I breathed a sigh of relief. At the moment, there was nothing that I needed to hear more. But you should also know that they all took their own lives within the next 3 months. You could have just left that part out. This is not going to be easy, but now that you know this going in, you'll have an advantage. Try and be ready for anything, 'cause nothing's off the table here. With our asses on the clock, we began making our way to the theater. When we arrived, there was a single, bored-looking cop sitting in his vehicle near the entrance. He didn't ask any questions when Sven flashed his badge. In fact, he looked pretty eager to leave. We didn't waste any time once we got in. Colin began setting up the film while we waited anxiously in the theater. We offered to help with the process, but he told us that we'd just slow him down. I wasn't going to argue with him there. I sat down in one of the seats, burying my hands into my face. I was nervous. There was no second guessing that fact. Can I even do this? I thought to myself. Hell, I have to do this. I felt somebody put a hand on my lap. At first, I thought it was Sven trying to comfort me, but then I realized that didn't seem like something he'd really do. Well, I'll be, Jimmy spoke up. The varmint's back. Against my better judgment, I snapped my head to the side, staring at what appeared to be a mask composed of a variety of segmented human faces. "Don't move, kid," Jimmy's voice boomed from across the theater. Before I knew it, the ghoulish face was blown to the side, blood exploding from the other side of its temple. My ears were ringing from the shot as I looked towards Jimmy, who was now holding some kind of oversized pistol. "You're welcome." "Jeez," I muttered, still trying to regain my bearings. A few seconds later, I heard Sven curse. I looked over, watching as a feral beast-looking creature grabbed him by the neck. Once again, Jimmy blasted it away, and my brain rang some more. It looked like Mr. Blank had regained his stamina, and I sure as hell wasn't excited about it. "Ah, damn, you son of a bitch." This time, Jimmy was the one cursing. Mr. Blank, now in the form of an oversized zombie wearing brass knuckles, had gotten the jump on him, forcing him to resort to a fistfight. But he was holding up surprisingly well, dodging, parrying, and countering each one of the zombie's strikes. Jimmy ended up pummeling it within a minute. "How the hell? Where did you?" I began asking, dumbfounded at his apparently vast array of combat skills. "I fought in the evisceration matches on a planet you wouldn't dare step foot on, partner. I know my shit," he said, grinning, as if I were supposed to understand remotely what the hell he was talking about. I didn't have time to ask, though. I could hear something breathing down my neck once again. "Come on, Colin. Hurry the hell up." And then it happened. The projector suddenly flicked on, and the breathing stopped. I scanned the theater, but Mr. Blank was nowhere to be seen. I locked eyes with Sven for a moment. This was it. This was the culmination of everything we'd been through. "Well, looks like this is it. I bid good luck to you both." The lights began to dim. I laughed to myself. Was this really necessary? The reaction was more of a coping mechanism than anything else. I was utterly frozen in terror. Sven and I were silent as we took our seats. For the first few seconds, I closed my eyes, afraid to open them even a little bit. But I knew that eventually, I had to. So I did. And I cannot begin to describe what I saw in front of me. Before I divulge what I saw in that theater, let's do a quick mental exercise. Hell. What does that word mean to you? More specifically, what do you visualize when you hear it? Put yourself in that environment right now. Are you walking through scorching flames while demons scream at you? A dark forest with thousands of beady eyes following your every move? Trapped underneath ice with something gnawing at your feet? Each one of us has an idea of what our own personal hell would look like. I found out what mine looked like in that theater. The film opened on a shot of a plain, abandoned city washed in dark blue. It was hard to tell what time of day it was, but the whole place just looked depressing. After a few seconds, a figure came stumbling into the frame. A man wearing plain clothes with distorted facial features. His movements were desperate, stumbling through the empty streets in an ostensible attempt to evade something. I found out what he was running from only a few seconds later. It was another man, naked this time, with black, oozing sores covering his entire body. There was also a bloody, dirty bag tied around his head. His limbs twitched and contorted as he ran after the faceless man, letting out an unearthly, croaking scream as he moved. The faceless man was screaming as well, although his voice sounded all too human. He sounded terrified. I'm not quite sure how long this sequence lasted. Not sure how long I was watching for, but it felt like hours. At a point, I even gave up on the objective at hand. I wanted to turn away from the screen so badly, but I couldn't. My eyes stayed glued on the horrific scene in front of me, and I couldn't move. I started wondering how Sven was holding up, watching something like this. It was only until later that I realized we weren't even watching the same thing at all. Personal hells. Everybody's different. At a point, I started feeling strange, as if I couldn't distinguish real life from what was happening on the screen. My attention was fixated on the faceless man, almost like I was seeing things through his perspective. Shit, I thought, before my mind drifted too far off the deep end. I realized something extremely important at the very last moment. It's just a movie, a really disturbing movie. The revelation came at the optimal time. I was already being sucked into Mr. Blank's realm. I could feel it, my physical self dissolving into an obscure void. Yet, I was cognizant of this fact, and while I was certainly scared, I was also determined. My vision went blank for an unknown duration. When I opened my eyes up, my world was washed in a dark blue. I could feel goosebumps popping up on my skin. I was freezing, despite wearing a hoodie and jeans. There was also something behind me. I turned around, seeing the man with the bag over his head staggering towards me. It didn't take a genius to discern what had happened. I was now in the movie. Not knowing exactly what to do and fueled by sheer impulse, I began running through the empty streets. After the initial shock, I tried remembering what Colin had told me. I had to remember that none of this was real, despite how real it felt. But at the same time, how the hell was this not real? The cold wind bit at my face. My joints ached against the concrete below. I was even beginning to run out of breath. It felt real as hell. My mind started becoming frantic. How the hell was this possible, and where the hell was I? We never feel physical sensations in our dreams. So what was this? I turned around again, noticing that the bag-headed man was getting closer, his inhuman shriek sending shivers down my spine. I was starting to lose it, starting to lose my own sense of reality. The streets ahead of me were endless and unchanging. Nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. I could hear myself beginning to whimper. Utter terror overwhelmed my senses, forcing me to abandon any of my previous thoughts, any connections that I had to the world I belonged in. Was this the world I belonged in now? How long had I been here? Maybe this was all I knew. It was an unnerving realization, and one that caused my eyes to begin watering. I was in hell. This was my existence. Cold tears began streaming down my face as I continued to run from the monstrosity behind me. I was beginning to forget where I'd even come from, and I was getting tired. I closed my eyes, preparing to give up entirely. Doing so hurt as my tears began freezing up. But wait, that didn't make any sense. I remember reading about this once, about how tears would only freeze at below 40, and it sure as hell wasn't that cold. It was an utterly random fact, and one that I had no reason to keep stored in my brain. But remembering it in that moment helped me more than I could ever know. If that part didn't make any sense, then what the hell was off about this situation? What was I doing here? I opened my eyes again and stared up at the sky. It was empty. No sun, no stars, no moon, no clouds. That wasn't right either. The buildings that surrounded me, I'd never seen a place like this before. I didn't belong here. This wasn't my world. This was Mr. Blank's world. And why had I come here? To save Lacey. None of this was real. I stopped in my tracks, catching my breath. I turned around, watching as the man behind me got slower and slower, before stopping only a few feet away from me. He looked confused, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't running, why I stopped. Because none of this was real. Why would I fear something that wasn't real? "Hey, asshole," I spoke up. "Where the hell is Lacey?" The man took a step back. "Don't you run! Where the fuck is she?" He started backing up faster, and my grin grew wider. "I'm gonna tear you apart with my bare hands if you don't tell me." I wasn't cold anymore. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Where the hell is she?" My own voice growing primal, my impulses fueled by a culmination of all the fear and frustration I've been feeling up until that point. I caught up to the bagged man relatively quickly, tackling and then wrestling him to the ground. I could feel his sores oozing all over me, which was quite nasty, but I forced myself to ignore it. "Where is she?" I asked again as I began strangling him. But instead of gasping for air, the man simply began laughing. Of course he would. This was all a farce. "What the hell?" I screamed. I grabbed the bag and ripped it off his face. What I found was a blank face staring back at me. "You think I'm scared of you?" A voice resonated throughout the space, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then the man began dissolving. Well, dissolving wasn't exactly the right word. He was morphing into thousands and thousands of insects. Horrified, I jumped back. I watched as the insects began crawling on top of each other, forming what appeared to be a humanoid torso on top of spider-like legs. And, of course, there was a giant, blank face at the very top of the abomination. "Run, boy!" The voice boomed again. Apparently things weren't going to be so easy. How the hell was I supposed to win? I could feel the fear rushing back into my system. Mr. Blank had just been screwing with me the entire time. With no other options in sight, I did what he said and began running from the insect monstrosity. I looked over my shoulder every now and then, watching as the grotesque entity crawled towards me, knocking down buildings as it did so. Surely this thing was faster than me. Wait. Of course it was. He never wanted to catch me. He just wanted me to keep running. Every trick he threw at me was an attempt to push me into a corner of fear I wouldn't be able to get out from. To hell with that. I was going to hit back. As scared as I might have been, I was going to force myself not to be. I skidded to a stop. I spotted a piece of wood off the street and picked it up, before turning around and chucking it at the thing. I missed, but the message was sent. The insect creature, aka Mr. Blank himself, stopped in its tracks as well, seemingly confused as what to do next. I wasn't scared, and Mr. Blank couldn't understand why. What is fear anyways? There's a dictionary definition, of course, but what evokes fear in one person won't necessarily evoke it out of the next. At this point, Mr. Blank was trying too hard. He transformed again into an even bigger monster resembling an amalgamation of black sludge, rotting corpses, and writhing tendrils. Was it scary? Maybe to a 14-year-old, but after everything that I'd seen, this only made me laugh. Laughing, joy, mockery, every emotion that contrasted fear and despair. That was the ultimate weapon against him. And then, I remembered the plan. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, getting the camera ready. Unfortunately, Mr. Blank disappeared before I could start recording. But nevertheless, the tables had turned. Who was scared now? I wasn't exactly sure where to go, so I just picked a random direction and began running. But something unexpected happened. The environment around me began to change. No more buildings, no longer washed in dark blue. I suddenly found myself standing in an endless field of yellow flowers with a cloudless sky above. For a moment, I was absolutely jarred. What the hell had happened and where had I ended up now? That answer soon became apparent when I looked down at the flowers. They weren't right, to say the least. They were blinking back at me. Some had mouths lined with razor-like teeth, vigorously chomping away at the air. Some had their petals replaced with writhing fingers ending in claws. This was somebody else's hell. A rather interesting one at that. Guess I better start running again. So, trying to be as careful as I could, I began stepping over the ghastly flowers, and after a few minutes, the environment changed again. This time it was night, and I was standing right in front of a precarious-looking rope bridge hanging over a deep crater. I was beginning to understand what was going on. I suppose that I'd broken the system in a sense. My own hell was no longer scary to me, so I was free to roam through everyone else's. Everyone who'd been trapped by Mr. Blank. Light bulbs began going off in my head. I remembered a conversation I once had with Lacey, right after we'd gone through a haunted house one Halloween. It was a conversation about fear, what we were most afraid of. What am I most afraid of? I remember her telling me. This is a weird one, but mazes. Yeah, imagine randomly being trapped in a maze and never being able to find your way out. Mazes. I now knew what to look for. I couldn't tell you how many different hells I ended up traversing. Probably upwards of 30, maybe close to 40. They were all unique, all utterly horrifying in their own sense. But what was even more interesting were the people I met along the way. Out of all the hells I found myself in, I came across 14 people who were trapped in them. 9 were already catatonic, and 2 were hysterical and impossible to reason with. As for the other 3, well, I don't want to give myself too much credit here, but I think I saved them. Not that it was easy. They weren't so willing to let things go. They truly thought that they were in hell, destined to live that way forever. They'd long forgotten about their past lives, who they were before, the time that they'd spent in the theater before being transported into Mr. Blank's world. And trying to convince them otherwise was nothing short of a task, especially given the environment around us. But I wasn't scared. I had to prove it to them. Nothing was going to kill us. Nothing was going to hurt us if we didn't let it. And by the time I finally found Lacey's hell, I had a grateful group of 3 by my side. Dash, a 21-year-old college kid, Nicole, a 25-year-old computer programmer, and Roman, a 27-year-old soldier. We sure as hell had been through a lot together at that point. It started feeling like days had passed since I was trapped in the theater, but my resolve never slipped. I was finding her no matter what. I nearly dropped to my knees in relief when I found myself standing inside the labyrinth. It had all paid off in the end. The walls were about 15 feet high, covered in cracks and coated in moss. The ground was also comprised of cracked stone. There were torches set up every few feet or so, illuminating the place, but just barely. So I guess splitting up's probably not the greatest idea, Dash said. Well, I wouldn't be scared if we do, though, Roman said, grinning at me. Well, I'm not scared of a fake place like this. I smiled back. When I met him, he'd been petrified, as if he'd given up on any kind of hope. But here he was now, ready to help me take down Mr. Blank and find Lacey. You're right. Nothing scary about this place. But Dash is also right. Better we stick together. Everybody nodded and we began searching. About every 10 turns, we'd come across some kind of creature wandering through. They ranged from eyeless little girls to ghoul-looking things. But that wasn't a problem. We'd seen more frightening things than that. Once it was obvious that we weren't taking the fear bait, the creatures pretty much ignored us. I can't keep track of how many turns we took. Over 100 at least. It was pretty obvious why Lacey wasn't exactly a fan of these. But eventually, we came across something different. A set of stairs leading down into darkness. Unlike the creatures, this posed a more uncertain threat. It evoked a fear of the unknown, making it exponentially more frightening than any of the corny monsters we'd encountered before. I could see hesitation rising amongst our group, but that was to be expected. That's exactly what Mr. Blank wanted. And for that reason, I didn't even think about it before descending the stairs, using my phone's flashlight to guide me along. It didn't matter if nobody followed. All that mattered was that I didn't let the fear stop me. To my surprise, though, I heard 3 sets of footsteps following behind me. I smiled to myself. This was it, the final stretch of all the madness I'd experienced so far. I'm not sure how far we walked. Not that it mattered. I'm sure everything in this world was nothing more than an illusion, even time. I had to tell myself that in order to deal with what we came across next. The stairs ended, leading to what appeared to be a bottomless void. Sounds emanated from below. They were obscure ones, things that I'd never heard before, leading to chills involuntarily crawling down my spine. Mr. Blank had certainly stepped up his game. No cheap scares here. What was presented in front of me petrified me to the bone. Once again, I could see hesitation amongst our group. "What do you think's down there?" Nicole asked. I paused for a moment, considering the question. Nothing. Nothing at all. I didn't let another thought cross my mind before jumping down. For the longest time, it felt like I was floating. If you asked me exactly how long, there's no way I could have told you. There was nothing around me, no sensation at all. I was in the void. Soon enough, though, I felt solid ground beneath my feet. I picked the direction I was already facing and began walking. Again, I had no sense of time. My mind began drifting with every step I took, but I never let it get away from me completely. An indiscernible amount of time later, I found myself standing in front of a stone clearing, with everyone else behind me. We were at the edge of the maze, and I'd found what I was looking for. I let out a deep exhale, probably the deepest one of my life. Lacey. She was right in front of me, curled into a ball with her back against the stone wall. She was wearing what she typically did, blue jeans and green flannel. Upon hearing my voice, she looked up at me, her eyes long red from what had to be a constant stream of tears. She didn't look happy to see me, but I didn't expect her to be. She'd probably been given too much false hope in a place like this. You're not real. Leave me alone," she whimpered, before beginning to cry once again. I approached her slowly. "Lace." She looked back up. I was one of the few people who called her that. "I'm one of the only real things in this entire place," I told her. I grabbed her hand. She pulled back a bit at first, but I didn't let her go. I didn't force it either. "We shouldn't be here. Let's get back to where we belong." Her skin was warm. So was mine. I saw a spark of understanding in her eyes, but before I could smile, a familiar presence made an appearance. A large shadow cast itself in the light of the torches. I looked up, seeing a tall, skeletal figure with a blank face leering down at us. Lacey flinched, but I just gripped her hand tighter. I looked up at Mr. Blank and shot him a self-satisfied grin. "There's nothing left for you to do here." A moment of silence followed as he continued leering. "Do you consider this a victory?" he asked. "No, not really. But you didn't win either. The whole time, my hand had been slowly reaching into my pocket for my phone. I grabbed it and opened the video camera, but it was too late. He disappeared in the blink of an eye. I grinned to myself. He was scared. I'd frightened the boogeyman. I looked back down at Lacey, who looked equally confused and terrified. But a sense of reality had returned to her expression. Before, it seemed as if she were in a trance, in the process of forgetting where she'd come from. Seth, wait, how are you? Looks like she's back, Nicole said from behind me. You're pretty good at this, aren't you? I suppose I was. Who are... Lacey began before trailing off. There's a lot I have to explain, but not here. Right, Roman said. So how will we get him back? I'm not sure how the answer to that question came to me. It was kind of just something I figured out along the way. What do you mean? We've been back the whole time. We never went anywhere, don't you remember? It took a second, but Roman began smiling. Oh, we never left the theater, did we? I nodded. The other two soon followed suit. This is some Dorothy-type shit, isn't it? Das said, grinning as well. No fucking place like home. I looked back at Lacey. We were never here. Don't you remember? It took a moment, but she nodded. Yeah, she said, her lips curling into a slight grin. I think I'm starting to. Pretty soon after, I remember my vision going black. Well, I'd be lying if I said that I remember what happened at all. I just remember waking up back in the theater, with the time I spent with Mr. Blank's world still fresh in my mind. It didn't feel like a dream, and it wasn't one. I sat up rapidly, feeling a hand on my shoulder as I did so. I turned around, seeing Sven smiling at me. You're finally back. It took you a while. Sven, did you? I found her. She's back. I looked around the room, but the only other people there were Colin, Jimmy, and a few bewildered-looking officers. Then, where is she? I looked around some more. Wait, where's Lacey? My heart dropped for a moment. If you will, one of the cops spoke up, we might be able to shed some light on that. Apparently, the police had found people who had gone missing in the theater in an abandoned warehouse 3 towns over. When they were first discovered, they were unconscious, albeit alive. But while they were being transported to the nearest hospital, 2 of them woke up. 2 university students, a male and a female, whose names hadn't been released. Apparently, a dazed woman had also been found wandering through the woods in a different state as well. I had a good feeling who they all might be. So did Sven. And I was right. I hauled ass to the hospital immediately. The cops tried to stop me, but Sven flashed his badge and got them off my case. He really was a good asset to have around. I looked through the window of the room the recovered students were staying in. I don't think my smile has ever been wider than when I saw Lacey sitting up in her bed, alive and playing with her hands as she usually did. She looked a bit frail, but there was no doubt about it. She was smiling. She remembered everything. I left without saying anything to her. All that I needed to know was that she was safe. Our reunion would come later. For now, she needed to rest. On the way back, I'd learn how she ended up in a warehouse so far away to begin with. Mr. Blank's influence was severe and far-reaching. He had a whole legion of fear-induced slaves doing his bidding in our world. Since he needed his victims to remain alive and undisturbed, he would order people who he'd petrified into obeying him in the past, like Colin, to storm the theaters and quickly drag the bodies out and then drive them off to a far, remote location. Once there, they'd keep the physical bodies alive while their frightened minds remained trapped in Mr. Blank's world. This time, they even took it up a notch. They replaced the video surveillance with loot footage taken when the theater was empty, in order to confuse the investigators even more. And it worked. A foolproof system, right? Not really. 7 arrests were made that day. It'll be an interesting trial for sure. Nevertheless, I can't say that I hate those people. I can't hate Colin either. There's only one person I can direct my anger towards. He's still alive out there, and I feel a lingering responsibility to rectify that. We'll see where this goes. Update. I got a call from Jimmy a few hours ago. I told him about what I saw in the other dimension, about how I wanted to get rid of Mr. Blank once and for all. Got something you might be interested in, he told me. You see, this varmint's apparently got a bounty on his head out there in the cosmos. We can make a real killing if we reel him in. I got another buddy who's interested as well. Name's Dex. Oh, but he's got a weird arm, so don't freak out when you meet him. A freaky weird arm. All right. I'll talk to you about the details later. Bye for now. Looks like the hunt might be back on.